Have you ever been scrolling on the internet and seen an ad like this and wondered, can they really smell that close to the original? Well, I spent the money, that way you don't have to. So join me as we take a look and review the brand Alt Fragrances. It all started whenever I was taking a look at my collection. See, I have a bunch of samples, decants from houses and brands that I really rather enjoy, but for one reason or another, I couldn't justify buying a full bottle of all these scents. And then I heard about Alt Fragrance. Took a look at their catalog and they had a surprising amount of not only designer, but more specifically niche for male and female unisex options. And so then I got curious. How about I review a brand? Now, given Alt as a company's marketing spend, all the ads they push out there, and also they have been known to produce sponsored content with creators, you may be guessing that I am affiliate or have been some other way compensated or given free product in order to do a review. So let me assure you, unfortunately, the truth is I had to spend my own money on these scents. Yeah, not a big fan of spending money. So if you really like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, and let's get into it. So I started off by buying 4 fragrances from the brand, and it showed up not super quickly. There was a slight delay where the tracking wasn't updating. It was stuck somewhere. I had to reach out to them once, and basically they said, hey, hold on, it'll be coming to you, before eventually it showed up. And at that time, I thought I was just gonna review a couple scents, but it really was a mixed bag. So the more I thought about it, the more I thought that I wanted to be thorough. If I was going to speak negatively about them, I want to make sure that it's an accurate representation. So I placed another order, and I gotta say I am kind of glad that I did. So in terms of the fragrance, after you take it out of the bubble mailer, you are left with a fairly nondescript box. All the boxes, at least as far as I can tell, are fairly uniform. All the fragrances should be extrait de parfums, and then they come in a myriad of different sizes, from travel and sample sizes, and then their standard sizes are 30 mLs, 60 mLs, and then 100 ml bottles. The box besides that will have brief description on the back, but nothing to indicate the actual fragrance within. You lift up the top, pry away a couple pieces of cardboard, and then you are greeted to the actual fragrance. Whenever you take the fragrance out, at least as far as I can tell, all the fragrances are fairly uniform. I did hear of some of the different sizes coming with different atomizers and having that impact the overall experience. However, their bottle and cap design leave a lot wanting. The bottles are super basic and definitely has an understated look. I think I'd be more forgiving on the bottle if it was the same design but made in higher quality. As it stands, there appears to be several issues with it. The fragrance sweats on the collar, and my best guess is that it is leaking juices very slowly on some of the fragrances. Some of the lids fit on super snugly. Others are like throwing a hot dog down a hallway. And also the screwing on of the cap seems to be super loose. So it becomes super easy for the entire thing to become unscrewed. In terms of the actual design on the front, it's not the worst, but again, given kind of everything else, it just leaves to a cheap looking experience. So onto the scents themselves. So in my first order, I picked a good representation of scents that I had a lot of experience with. That way I could critique them closely. So of course, I had to pick up Alt's take on Baccarat Rouge 540 Extrait. It's called Crystal Intense, number 32, and like all the other fragrances, it is an extrait de parfum. So right off the top, and something that carries through a lot of their fragrances, but this one in particular, is whatever carrier oil or alcohol that they use in there is super prominent. Now, in the Untold, I brought it up because we really were nitpicking the small details, and it didn't have a long-lasting effect on the fragrance. But with this one here, even into the dry down, you almost get this shadow of cheap fragranceness in it. Smelling it closely, it does a better approximation of the extrait version version of Baccarat Rouge, it is not as wafting or elusive and kind of has that consistent almondy, kind of sweet, sultry base within it. A lot of the components of Alt's formulation is fairly flat. It's missing a lot of the dimensionality and kind of subtlety of the original fragrance. After I smelled this the first time, I immediately lowered my expectations. And out of most of these fragrances, this one, I think you'd be better served elsewhere. So the next scent that I picked up from them was none other than Cherry Smash number 12. Now, the original Tom Ford's Lost Cherry, which this is a dupe of, I had a decant of it, and while I enjoyed the fragrance, I had major issues with its longevity. I would spray it on my skin, get about an hour of moderate projection before it settled into a skin scent, before it finally dissipated at hour 4 or 5. It made it untenable for me to consider purchasing a full bottle, even if I did like the fragrance as much as I did. The fragrance is a cherry almond kind of boozy accord, and it pairs well with mixing with other fragrances. In fact, pair this with Baccarat Rouge 540 and it is chef's kiss, fantastic. So leads me to Alts. Immediately you can smell the difference. I'll say in relation to the Crystal Intense, while it does have the carrier agent smell in it, it is far less prominent here. I will say in comparison to the original, this, and this is the only way I know how to describe it, has more of a matte finish than the kind of glossy booziness that the original had. It still has all the same elements, but it's almost kind of compressed and a tad bit more scratchy with the particular notes. However, I really love this. The other one would never be able to fit into my rotation given how limited it is, and I definitely couldn't justify getting it. But this fragrance right here lasts 8 hours, no problem. It also projects the whole time, never settling into a skin scent. And for all that, this is a fantastic pickup. So the next fragrance is gonna be Nicotiana by Alt Fragrance, number 32. And it is inspired by Tom Ford's Tobacco Vanille. Now, the original one, I was able to pick up a sample from Saks and wore it sparingly through a month or two. I knew from first smell that it wasn't gonna be a fragrance that immediately grabbed me in, but could challenge me to expand my palette. So I was excited when I saw Alt Fragrance had their inspired by fragrance. Tobacco Vanille, obviously prominent notes of tobacco, vanilla, but also cacao, cedar, fruity kind of notes in there as well. But I'll tell you what, none of the other fragrances repulsed me as much as this one upon receiving it. Immediately, I was met with the cheapest tobacco smell, the sort that you may smell in Swisher Sweets or Black and Milds, and this overwhelming mentholy, toothpastey aftertaste. The mixture of those two things was not appetizing whatsoever. I'm not sure if I've got a bad batch, but given by how it settled in its maturation, I suspect it's not. Either I got an unusually fresh batch, or this is how they send it out to most customers. After a month or two of sitting on the shelf, I was able to go back and revisit, and indeed it has improved significantly. You still get that same carrier smell that you would in the Crystal Intense, but the tobacco has settled down. It's not as fresh and is woven into the other notes a bit more, giving it texture and more suitability. It kind of has this potpourri center or heart to it. And then you have the slightest hint of vanilla lifting off the top. So even while it has settled down, I would say if anything, it's about 60 to 70% similar. Most of the difference in my mind is just a quality difference, where this composition is all about the quality. Make any sacrifice and it changes the profile significantly. So the next fragrance is going to be Thorned Rose number 4. This one is Alt's take on Rose Prick by Tom Ford. And I've experienced that scent in a similar vein to Tobacco Vanille, where I was able to procure a sample and nurse that sample for a month or two as I learned to grow to enjoy it. It has a trio of 3 different roses in there. It has this earthly quality to it with the patchouli at the base, and then you have turmeric in the top note mixed with some pepper pepper in there for good measure. The more it kind of settles down, it gets rid of the kind of powderiness to the overall scent and compresses into this sultry patchouli rose scent. So how does this one compare? This one compares almost perfectly. Super impressed with this one. You don't really get that chemically smell that you do in some of the other scents that Alt makes. And the overall composition remains the same. If anything, it is a little bit more kind of flat, compressed. It loses some detail in the rose, but all the other spices are encapsulated in this formulation perfectly. I haven't had any issues with it macerating or changing smell as I've had it. And I feel in terms of its projectivity and longevity that if anything, they cranked it up about 30%. The original one, I never had any issues with longevity, but this one you definitely won't. It does fall more in a feminine quality. However, given all the earthly tones and subtle sweetness that flows through it, I think it is very easily a unisex fragrance, although you may have to give slightly more consideration to wearing it. All right, so the next scent is Bold Love. This is Alt's take on by Kilian's Love Don't Be Shy. The fragrance that drew me in due to its sporadic playfulness, super sweet, almost annoyingly so. But it was so eloquent and complex in terms of how it pulled it off. You couldn't help but enjoy the scent. The original had this slight little twinge of texture at the top before quickly throwing you to the middle where there was a melody of white floral notes. From neroli to iris to rose to orange blossom, you had everything there, and it was constantly evolving as it dried down. Different elements were being brought to the forefront before it settled into this very distinctly edible base. Super sweet all the way through. It had this kind of glossiness that would envelop every single note in there. That way you knew it smelled sweet. So how does Alt compare? Let's give it a sniff. So you can tell that their formulations have gotten better. There's this slight twinge of the carrier oils in there, but it's almost as if nothing is super prominent in the top. There's a little bit of a citrus before it goes directly to the middle. I feel like its overall composition is missing several key notes. Instead, in the middle, you got the neroli, you got the orange blossom and honeysuckle before developing into the base of nondescript sweetness. It doesn't have the all-enveloping, realistic, gourmand or edible nature to it. If I were to describe how it compares, I think the best way is if a designer tried to copy this niche fragrance. It becomes flat, it becomes two-dimensional, and the things that justified its existence, its sweetness, its obnoxiousness, aren't really there. So you're left with a more hollowed out experience. That being said, my purposes for the fragrance were to enjoy it on a personal level. If you're somebody that likes the DNA of it and maybe really relates to that super sweet nature and wants something more suitable to everyday wearing, I could see how this may fit in or work for you. So the next fragrance is White Sun. And this particular fragrance is Alt's take on Tom Ford's Sauvage Blanc. Now that's a fragrance that I previously did a review on. I found it to be an interesting fragrance because from the initial spray and kind of for the first hour, it is this two-dimensional kind of fun sunscreeny scent, but fairly simplistic. Whereas when you go out into the heat or as it starts to settle down, you really feel as if the white notes start to become more prominent and develop until it completely envelops the entire fragrance. And so I thought this fragrance would be an interesting comparison because that sense of nuance and development is not super common in clone fragrances. So let's see how they did. So what they do here is something a bit interesting. It feels like they formulated it to be a good halfway point between the initial and the developed. The white floral note is way more prominent upon opening, and they kind of make a thinner but more prominent amber and coconut tones in it, whereas you feel the top solar notes kind of dissipate fairly quickly. So I understand why they would make that compromise. However, for me, my particular enjoyment of the fragrance was that sense of development, and really once it fully blossomed, like there was nothing to compare to it. The notes were so well represented in the original, whereas this one feels like a caricature of its inspired fragrance. All right, so the next fragrance is Girls Gone Wild. Now, this fragrance isn't there to evoke your adolescence staying up way too late watching cable TV. This fragrance is by Kilian's take on Good Girl Gone Bad. Now, the original fragrance, maybe I didn't get to spend as much time with it as I would have wanted. However, in my recollection, it is very similar in a certain way to Love Don't Be Shy. Instead of settling into a gourmand base, you have it going more into a cedar amber base and slightly more mature or sophisticated white floral composition. In the top, you have Osmanthus before you settle into a mid of tuberose and rose before settling into an amber and cedar base. The way it flowed and interacted with every ingredient, it was like you were watching the composition of a soup taking form. So how do they compare? If you were to smell it in passing, you may confuse it for the original. It's probably the best thing that I can say for it. It doesn't have any medicinal or cheap undertones to it, but its composition leaves a lot lacking. Whereas the original one, I like the separation in between the notes, the little dance that it would do. This one is a flat rendition of it. Upon first sniff, you are greeted with the top notes, but then quickly dive down through the middle into the base. It doesn't retain that addictive texture of the cedar, kind of warm and embalmed in amber. It has this kind of slightly there dissipated feel to it. So as it stands, I think it is halfway decent. If you like the DNA or you have a full bottle of it, yes, you could use those on those days where you're just running errands and want to be reminded of it. But in terms of a replacement of the experience for the actual fragrance, it does not compare to it. All right, the last and final fragrance is Amber Angel. Now, the fragrance that this is inspired by is Angel Share by Kilian. It's one that I don't have a whole bunch of experience. I smelled it off a strip once or twice, but don't have a lot of personal experience. However, in my recollection, it's almost as if Kilian was going more towards the designer way with their Share line, where the composition was more well blended, targeting those notes that have become popular. There's that boozy, caramely, gourmandy thing going on there. So how does this one compare? So right off the top, you got that kind of boozy nature to it pressing through, settling down into a sort of cider smell. You do have a bit of sandalwood in the base. It isn't super prominent. Of course, you have a little bit of vanilla that is adding some sweetness to the overall thing. So this one here, I feel as if maybe they could have done a better job, or maybe I'm misremembering, but it smells like apple cider potpourri. It has kind of gourmandy, but I get the general sense that the quality of the ingredients are at play here, whereas they are lower quality and representing a different side of themselves in it that impacts the overall composition. I would say it evokes the thought of the original fragrance, but in terms of how similar it is, I feel like it's easily apparently a different fragrance. So in my experience with wearing this, the apple cidery tames down and the most prominent part becomes that potpourri-ish center to it, which in my wearing is a bit off-putting. Definitely is a kind of cozy unisex fragrance, but it can be easily cloying. And I feel, again, that's the quality of the ingredients doing that. I feel like this is a formulation where it could easily be polarizing if not done just so. And I feel like they veered more on the side of the not so part of it. The top notes, the things that whiffed off the fragrance here are really rather enjoyable. It's just once you get past that, the cracks start showing. All right, so that brings us to the final conclusion. Is Alt worth it? And considering their fragrances that we've reviewed, they are hit and miss in terms of their individual releases. I would say on the whole, I experienced a fair bit of them pleasantly, but when they miss, they typically miss big. So how does a company like Alt fit into the fragrance landscape? I think in a couple ways. If you are somebody that is just looking to smell good, but maybe you don't want to smell like everybody else, then I think Alt Fragrance could provide the sense that would help you accomplish that. If you are somebody that is new to fragrances and you have felt underserved by the designer market, but maybe not know where to start in terms of niche fragrances, then maybe a company like this could get you to a place where you understand a wider range of particular scents in a way that you can justify spending $200 on a scent that you've never had your nose on. Or in my particular case, I think I have a particular use case for companies like Alt that produce clone fragrances. Sometimes you come across a fragrance that you really enjoy. Maybe it's more on a personal level. Maybe it's super nostalgic, but for whatever reason, it doesn't work for you. You would have a hard time justifying it. For example, Tom Ford's Sauveur Blanc is a perfect example of it. That sunny and solar accords that run through its DNA, that kind of amber in the base, and then the white florals in the mids is something I enjoy, but it's not ever gonna be something that would jive with me for an everyday wear. It's something as an enthusiast I appreciate, but I don't know that I could spend the $200 or more that it would cost to buy that fragrance. And so Alt comes in and says, hey, we will give you 70% of what Sauveur Blanc is for a fraction of the cost. And a lot of these fragrances are equivalent in that nature. And in terms of how much I spend on it versus the value I'm receiving, I think it's fine. However, I think it is understated some of the difference between it. My only prescription beyond what I've just said is that if you enjoy a particular fragrance, like really, really enjoy it, it could be your daily wear, or maybe you just have this special fascination with it. Here's a crazy thought. Support the company. Support the perfumers that brought you notes that pleasure you. It'll be worth it. Again, these are not meant to replicate it one for one. And if you are an enthusiast, if in particular you enjoy those specific notes and the transformation and the overall composition of it, then please stick with the actual fragrance. With that said, my time is up here. Thank you all for making it this far. Until next time, see you.